The Oberheim OB-1 is a bit of an enigma. There were at least 3 designs, from the black and grey livery to match the 1979 released OBX, to a couple of black versions with light grey knobs, one with the patch buttons above the Oberheim logo and one with the logo below the same buttons. Even its launch date is a bit contentious, and while it was definitely shown at NAMM in June 77, some claim it was actually released in 78, while others say it was 79. Regardless, it had an initial price tag of just under $2,000 and followed on the heels of the previous Oberheim SEM-based instruments and competed with rivals including Korg's MS-20, the Minimoog, the ARP Odyssey and others. Like most of its rivals, it featured 2 oscillators, 2 envelopes, 1 LFO and a low-pass filter. However, OB-1 had something that gave it a huge advantage, namely being the first monosynth with 8 user programmable memory slots. Yep, with the OB-1, OBX and Prophet 5, elegant programmability was finally here. Well, kind of, because while the OBX and Prophet 5 used the Z80 microprocessor, the OB-1 didn't. And as a consequence, it wasn't quite as comprehensive when it came to saving parameter values. Instead of the Z80, Oberheim used a digital board and DAC to plot and recall the settings for digitally controlled analog parameters, including stepped VCO coarse tuning, waveform selections, VCF cutoff and resonance, and envelopes. You can recognise these digitally controlled parameters by the black knob tops. However, the grey top knobs are not digitally controlled, and as a consequence they cannot be stored as part of your patch. These include VCO fine-tune, a really neat VCF fine-tune knob, plus all the keyboard and LFO knobs. And this meant that while you could store the main parameter settings, you would still need to manually dial in any of the grey knob top parameters to get back to your intended sound. Now on the surface, this may seem a bit of a faff, but in practice, thanks to this visual colour code, it was relatively straightforward and undoubtedly helped any player in a live performance environment. To save your patch, you would touch and hold the right button for a few seconds until the manual light flashed, then touch one of the 8 memory buttons. Occasionally, you'd have to touch the metal front panel too, but this would store your patch in the chosen allocation. However, there is one drawback when recalling memories. If you are not in manual mode, only those grey top knobs will operate. It also had a few other neat features that helped set it apart from its rivals, including continuously variable sawtooth to triangle or pulse width waveforms. What's more, we can modulate the shape of these via the LFO to create interesting textures and timbres. And of course, OB-1 had that Oberheim creamy sound, which when reinforced by sub-oscillators on each VCO could sound massive. But here's where we get to one of OB-1's foibles. The level of these sub-oscillators and the level of the fundamental oscillators were controlled by switches offering positions of off, -3 dB, or on. Now this reveals a hint of what's to come with OBX, OBXA and OB8 with the off, half or full button options. but it's kind of a shame because it removes a degree of sound sculpting subtlety that level knobs would have provided. Back on a more positive tip though, OB-1 had hard sync and cross mod, the latter great for dirty, dissonant and clangorous tones. This cross mod would appear on the polyphonic OBX and be used to great effect by David Sylvian and Richard Barbieri on Japan's Tin Drum album, before disappearing completely on the subsequent OBXA. The VCF had 2-pole and 4-pole options and is very powerful. The 2-pole mode really starts to scream with the resonance cranked up. And with a 4-stage filter envelope as opposed to the SEM's 3-stage envelopes, there's more sound shaping potential. Interestingly, while the filter is definitely based on the SEM design, it's also incredibly similar to the Roland SH7 filter, also released around 1978. The LFO is simple but fairly comprehensive, offering sine, square and sample and hold waveforms, plus rate and delay knobs. It can be routed to the VCO pitch, VCO continuous waveforms for pulse width modulation and that triangle to sawtooth modulation, plus the obligatory filter modulation. The keyboard controls include portamento, envelope reset, transpose up and down, and a really neat VCF knob for real-time control over cutoff when replaying any of those memorized patches. Finally, we have the bend control section. And this is interesting because previously Oberheim had neglected things such as wheels for real-time performance, something Tom Oberheim later acknowledged as an oversight. On the OB-1 though, we have a paddle, which, depending on the adjacent switch settings, controlled modulation of VCO2 or both, or pitch bend of the same. With pitch bend, we also have the option of narrow or broad bend ranges. And what's slightly odd, but cool nonetheless, is that in modulation mode, pulling the paddle towards you introduces a 1 semitone pitch bend and noise. According to Tom Oberheim, the OB-1 came and went, possibly falling between the cracks as the polyphonic OBX took the world by storm in '79. And that's why we don't really have any figures in terms of how many were made. But it was used by many esteemed artists, including Herbie Hancock, Larry Dunn, Michael Bodiker, Geddy Lee, Vangelis, and many, many more. In our opinion, OB-1 is one of the mono-synth greats, certainly up there with the Minimoog, Odyssey, Oscar and Cat. A mono-synth offering something very different, but also remaining very Oberheim.